Welcome to the show, Brain Health, Unchaining Your Pain. I am super excited to have the phenomenal Christopher Freeze on the show today. Welcome to the show, Christopher.
Thank you, Ruth. Appreciate it very much.
So for those of you that don't know, Christopher has a phenomenal career. He served as the Executive Director of the Mississippi Department of Human Services in the FBI. During the end of Governor Phil Bryant's tenure. Before that appointment, he served 23 years with the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, retiring as the special agent in charge of the FBI's Jackson Division. And during his tenure, he oversaw all the FBI operations and administration work in the state of Mississippi. Since January 2020, he's dedicated his time to helping leaders succeed by understanding the impact of trauma on trust, embracing trauma-informed leadership to improve trust, and demonstrating how the science of hope can transform trust. And I am just so excited to talk to you today in the context of the topic brain health and how we can help people really unchain their pain, particularly given your journey has been really so different to the journey that some people, the Joe Public go on. So I'm really excited. Thank you for joining us. So first question, Christopher, to yourself. Could you just introduce yourself to people and just let them know who you're really serving now, what your vision is and what really is your passion now in life?
Yes, I will. Thank you very much. I've arrived where I am at this point in my life very non-traditionally. I am at the present moment going back to school at the Oklahoma University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to work on my PhD. And so, as you mentioned, I spent a career in the FBI and a little bit of time at the Department of Human Services. But right now, I'm studying about the science of hope with one of the preeminent leaders in that area, Dr. Chan Hellman. And trying to understand how that science can help people in many different ways. And so, again, most of my professional career, was in law enforcement.
Yeah.
And so it's been a big change for me to sort of step back and think about and see things a little bit differently, and then try to find a way, because based on what I saw, I was so moved by it. I'm trying to find a way to help people in a meaningful manner.
Oh my goodness, it's so needed now in today's society, given the situations that we've been in, and obviously how the world has evolved and changed since really 9/11 and the just the heightened awareness of what people are subjected to in terms of not only social media influences on their perception of hope. Mm-hmm. But also the underlying terrorism elements that we often unfortunately have to deal with, or we witness thirdhand through the media, and also just the current COVID situation. So I'm just so interested to explore the science of hope in the context of brain health. But before we dive into that really exciting topic, I'd love to understand what inspired you, what inspired you to join the FBI in the first place, because it's not a typical career pathway that one chooses.
I'd like to say I had this great story and that it was a lifelong dream and it all came together at one moment, but it was really kind of benign in many ways. So I graduated high school, went to college, studied to be an accountant. And at one point, I actually got my CPA license to be an accountant. But I realized working for the state of Tennessee, where I lived at the time, that, you know what, I'm not a very good accountant. I'm really not sure this is where I want to spend my life. And so within the Division of State Audit, they had a little investigative unit, about 4 people, investigated from a non-law enforcement perspective complaints that the state received on everything from contract fraud to little public corruption to theft of funds. And there was an opening, I was able to go. So I had a case. There was an attorney who was hired by the Department of Transportation to help the Department of Transportation buy right of way. So when the transportation needs to put a road through your property, they have to pay you fair market value for it. They just can't take it. So they would use this outside attorney to take care of the legal transactions. Well, she was taking some of that money and stealing the money and sort of kiting it and going down that road. And we found out about it. We started investigating it. And because most of the money in Department of Transportation is federal money, the local FBI agents from the office there in Nashville, Tennessee, where I was at the time, came out to visit. And I shared with them what we were doing. And over the course of a couple of days, one of the agents said, "Hey, you look like you know what you're doing. Have you ever thought about a career in the FBI?" And I said, "Nope, not until now." And he said, "Let's go to lunch." and so we got in his car and we went down the highway to go to lunch, and he's driving kind of fast, and I think he turns his siren on and then the lights on, and it's just like a kid in the candy store, right? And all of a sudden, I got to do this. This is awesome. And so I applied, and let me just tell you that in the course of my 23-year career, I might have turned lights and siren on about 3 or 4 times. So he was definitely pulling the right strings where he got me interested in being in the FBI. But it really didn't pan out the same way. But it was great. I joined the FBI in 1996 as a new agent. Went through Quantico, as new agents do, and then started my career in Richmond, Virginia, where I used my previous experiences to investigate public corruption matters and money laundering and other sort of what we call white collar crime. And so that's really my foray into the FBI. I worked with people who truly it had been their lifelong dream. Yeah. They'd watch the TV shows, and that was something that they were excited about. But at the end of the day, we all came together that first day and started our journey into this marvelous experience of the FBI.
Yeah. Do you know, I met, when I was in Washington, D.C., I met someone in the FBI when I was staying in a hotel, and he shared with me books he'd written about his experiences over in Middle East. And I was just fascinated about, you know, the inside workings of the FBI. And obviously, being a reservist in the military, it was something that piqued my interest, and my interest was peaked at a very young age when my brother was going through cadets as Air Force cadets. So I found it fascinating. I actually can really relate to the drive that you went on, because when I was in the States much later on, I was offered a ride along by a San Diego police officer, and had to sort of sign my life away, and got shown, you know, these are the semi-automatic weapons. This is how you unload it. Don't worry, obviously you're military, so if we ever get in a shootout, you know, this is what we're going to do. And I'm just thinking, oh my goodness, we're going to have like a massive incident, you know, an international issue if I'm seen as sort of using a weapon in the US, a British Army officer. So anyway, I can really relate to the ride along. It was just absolutely phenomenal. But the reality of the situation was obviously for the police officer very different, and I'm sure for your situation, you know, you were coming across incidences as many people do in the forces that the general public have very little awareness of, but you obviously have a very heightened awareness of as to what's going on under the radar, as it were.
Yeah, I think you find that in the law enforcement profession, you can't help but sort of see the world a little differently because of the people you're engaging with and the problems that they struggle with, and that the actions they take that cause them to intersect and interact with law enforcement. And so there's this repetitiveness of sort of the same people, the same types of people, the same problems over and over again. All of a sudden, it does sort of jade the way you see the world. And I remember that I was a new agent. I've been in about 5 years when you mentioned 9/11 earlier, and I was in Richmond. And so when the Pentagon was hit on 9/11, I was part of the evidence response team out of Richmond.
Wow.
And you can imagine we're trying to draw as many resources as possible. And so by the morning of September 12th, while the Pentagon is still smoking, fire department still trying to put out a little bit of the fire, we roll in to start doing our work in the recovery and the evidence gathering. And since we're talking a little bit about brain health, that might have been the first time that I really felt like my brain health was being affected. And it's just one example of what I know other law enforcement officers face on a regular basis. But because of you seeing the trauma before you, the results of the horrific act, and you're in it day in and day out for 2 to 3 weeks, and all of a sudden, you're the feelings of being overwhelmed and sort of that despair and uncertainty, it just really starts playing on you. And I remember as I look back now going, that was a major event. Obviously, we all experienced the after effects, but for me, having been right there and sifting through ashes and remains, so forth, that was a moment I'll probably never forget.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because I think we see it on the news, we see it played out in social media, and we obviously remember it, but we don't. The general public, unless they're actually physically there in the situation, don't get the full brunt of the experience of all the senses that get triggered. And our sensors that are connected into our brain, we have the nasal sensors, the one that goes straight to our amygdala, and that obviously incredibly powerful in terms of some of the experiences that people witness, particularly one you've described. And so it bypasses anything else and immediately triggers you into a fight, flight, freeze or defensive rage. And how you're able to deal with it is obviously dependent on what you've experienced in that situation, what you've experienced before. And when you've never experienced anything before like that, it's going to put you on a high alert and make it incredibly memorable for all the wrong reasons. I think we don't pay enough credence to that for the emergency services, the police forces, and also the people that are involved in that incident who are victims of the incidents as well, and really acknowledging that people need time to decompress.
That's right.
Much the same way we do from a military perspective, is people need the time, but they also need the tools to help them decompress, because time isn't a healer for trauma. It can often exacerbate it. It's much like leaving a broken leg and hoping that time will heal it. It doesn't work that way.
That's right.
It certainly doesn't work that way from an emotional trauma or a mental trauma, or a spiritual trauma, in terms of losing your job, if you will, losing your sense of purpose. That can be traumatic, particularly with COVID. Is we need to equip people with the right tools, so that they have that opportunity to heal as soon as possible after the experience.
Absolutely. And at the time we probably didn't have the right tools. We're looking at just 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's a long time.
There's a lot that we've learned since then, but I wish we'd had some of those tools, and I'm grateful that we do now have many of them, and that people are able to get help. And you're right. You have that a major event, it's a sort of a one-time major event that has an effect on you, and then all the other times throughout my career, it was usually the repetition of a lot of smaller events, particularly as I saw that in other people, right? The persistent trauma, consistent trauma that they have day in and day out playing out in their lives. And so Yeah, and I look back and go, yeah, they didn't get the help they needed either when they were young. And what are we doing for them?
Yeah. And I think it's important, to recognize that trauma stacks,
Yes.
it's like a tower. It stacks like a Jenga block.
Yep.
And eventually it becomes unstable and topples over, and people, that's when people crash, because they can't keep stacking anymore.
That's right.
The towers become unstable, and it's important that they take action as soon as they feel that someone's pulling a piece out, that they can put it back in again and rebuild that part of their mind, to re-normalize it, to make it stable, and bring back down that excitation level that we have as a result of trauma.
I went to school, as I mentioned earlier, to be an accountant, right? And so I'm sort of focusing on business and that sort of thing. And it's only been recently, within the last probably 4 or 5 years, that I start hearing words such as poly-victimization and complex trauma, and I've considered myself fairly well educated and informed, but this is a whole new world. I mean, this is a whole new way of thinking and seeing and applying things that up until a certain point it had never occurred to me, or that I needed to know that, or that it would play such an important part, or could play such an important part in the work that I was doing in law enforcement at the time. So yeah, it's definitely a journey. It's definitely something that it's great about your podcast here, your video cast, that sharing these ideas and understandings around brain health, because we definitely need it, because if you didn't grow up with it, if you didn't invest yourself in studying it, you may be like me, you didn't fully appreciate it and appreciate the tools that are available for us.
Yeah. And to be clear, I had no concept of brain health myself personally. Even having done a degree in medical imaging, it wasn't until I had a traumatic experience in my own life that I really had to go on a transformational journey. There was, I was at the bottom of what I was prepared to tolerate. Right. And really, I really wanted to climb the way out of the hole that I was in. And brain health became part of my learning, much like you're doing a PhD now. But, I had to educate myself in it, because nobody talks about the brain.
That's right.
They talk about an ethereal concept of mental health, which is really important. But the trouble is that we label ourselves in the conversation by the language we use. Whereas when we actually physically talk about the organ, like we talk about heart health and health of our bones,
exactly,
we don't talk about beats per minute health and label us as being at fault. We talk about the heart, the organ, and the group. What I think is really important in the context of the brain health discussion is that we can have open dialogue, we can have open conversation about brain health, because we're talking about the brain. We're not talking about us. And that is really important for me, is to really open the dialogue and make it an easier conversation to have, because we remove the labeling associated with it and really focus on what the root cause of the problem is. And often the root cause goes back to trauma. And I know this show is all about brain health. What for you, given we're talking about this now, does optimal brain health mean for you personally, given the journey that you've been on?
I thought about that. And for me, I think optimal brain health is really captured in one word. And for me, that's peace. Right. So for me, I think we have a lot of this chaos, a lot of this noise, anxiety, the stresses, the poor relationships that we have with each other, the work environments, the spiritual environments, even sports, right? Everything we do, it just seems to be a lot of chaos and noise, and our brains are fighting this for attention, and we're trying to find ways. You've heard the words about being resilient and have good well-being, and we keep going to that because I'm pretty sure our brains are going 90 miles an hour, and we're just looking for peace with ourselves,
Yeah.
peace with our families, peace with our communities. And so I really spent some time trying to think about that. And for me, that's what has given me some sort of peace of mind, is this idea that I just want to be at peace, because then I think I'll be at my most healthiest state.
Do you know, I've never heard anybody describe it like that, and I think that's incredibly powerful. We use the 3 words in Havening typically to help people, and it's safe, peaceful, and calm. And it's so important that we bring that brain down, like you say, as it's, you know, whizzing around 100 miles an hour trying to deal with all the chaos that we've created in today's society. And we really need to just give ourselves, I like to say, permission to breathe. And permission to feel, and we don't give that to ourselves enough. You know, even the sleep we used to have 100 years ago was 9 hours on average. You know, we're down to 7 or less, depending on what your work situation is. We're really disadvantaging ourselves in a brain health perspective because of the lifestyle that we've created in the 21st century, and obviously for some people that lifestyle just has to pause so that they can get some peace and recalibrate. We get their brain back.
You know, we talk about people, and maybe we've all had this experience, but we know people who we need to find some type of substance to help us sleep. Why? Because we can't get to sleep, because our minds are always racing. And it doesn't mean that, you know, we're just focused on work and have some big day ahead of us. And I'm talking about the regular routine. We just never being able to sort of re-regulate ourselves because of either the past traumas we've experienced or the current traumas that we're involved in. And so many people are robbed of that, as you said, that state of peace where you can have good sleep, you can get well rested and re-energized, and feel good about the next day, not that the next day is going to be, you know, more chaos. And you know, we've talked. I remember when I heard, I think it was Dr. Bruce Perry. So he's pretty well known in the neuroscience and in the mental health field. And I heard him speak one time, and I think Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, Surgeon General in California, has said this as well. When we talk about our heartbeats, you know, when have some type of traumatic event, you know, it goes up, and then if we're lucky, you know, it'll come right back down because we have our friends, we have our family, we have, you know, we're able to re-regulate pretty quickly, and you know, and then we have the stress that kind of goes up and stays up for a while, but after a short period, it comes back down. But as Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris has said, what happens when your trauma, your stress goes up, your heart rate goes up, and it stays up, right? And it just stays there for days and weeks and months, and you never get reset. And then all of a sudden, that's where all these adverse childhood experiences, the childhood trauma, the way our brains, you know, are formed and how they function, get sideways. And then we're continually struggling with that because it's affecting our decision making. It's affecting our ability to have good cognitive, clear thinking, and it all relates to primarily, probably, the trauma that we've experienced and the stress and anxieties that come with that. And at the end of the day, it's like, how do we get our health back in a way that, as you said, if we had a heart problem or a leg problem or something else, we'd go to the doctor, we'd seek out a way to address it. And yet we self-medicate and we struggle with it often day in and day out.
Yeah. And do you know, I think it's really important, you know, because we often forget that our brain is, you know, in the context of the old science approach, the brain was separate to the body. But actually, obviously, it's an essential, it's the engine of everything about us. And when you talk about the fact that, you know, we can get ourselves to a state where we're always on, that's when our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is fired up and just working too hard. It's like we've opened the throttle on the car and we've put our foot to the floor and we can't take our foot off. And we end up wearing everything out. And it isn't until somebody yanks the handbrake or slams on the brake and said, right, stop, that accelerator gets unstuck, and we can take it to maintenance. You can take our engine to maintenance and get it maintained, but it's knowing how to maintain it. And it's very easy for people to wear out their adrenal glands because of this constant stress. And often people don't take the time, we self-medicate to deal with the immediacy of the pain, the emotional pain, the overwhelm, that feeling that the accelerator is always on. Rather than acknowledging that accelerator is on, we turn to alternative means to ignore it.
That's right.
So we just forget the fact that we're driving too fast, until somebody eventually gives us a ticket, or yourselves come along and say you broke the law.
Right.
Let's talk about this. What's causing you to do that? And we realize actually we need to kind of down-regulate our brain and bring it back into balance. And that balance can be different for everybody, because everybody's brain is unique. So we need to understand how our brain is functioning, what parts of our brain are working too hard, like you say, what parts of our heart, our heart can race really fast. The same is true in our brain. Our parts of our brain, especially from a trauma perspective, is we can have racing parts of our brain, particularly the amygdala, which goes into the overactivity in that part of our brain, as well as our thalamus, which is a deep limbic system, which is responsible for our emotions, our mood control, and it's just really important that we take that time to allow people to learn about their brain, and image it in a way that people can understand it's not them that's at fault. Their brain is in trouble, and let's find a way through to help them. And I'm really interested, you mentioned the word peace, because I'd love to know, did you feel that, through your career within the FBI, did you feel you were able to maintain that sense of peace for yourself? Or I know we've talked about one situation where obviously that state of peacefulness was quite disrupted, but how did you observe that state change, that peaceful state change throughout your career? Because obviously it was quite a long tenure within the FBI.
I think that what really allowed me many times, not all the time, but many times, to deal with that chaos, that tempo, was the outside environment I created. Right. So I tried very hard to leave my work at work. And at home, I had my family, I had my friends, I had some extracurricular activities that I engaged in. And I tried hard to disconnect myself from what I saw on an everyday basis and remind myself that that all people aren't the type of people I see regularly. That there is a difference. But it became harder in many ways as I promoted up through the organization. All of a sudden, you take on more and more responsibility, and the phone calls come regularly because
you get more and more volume.
Exactly, and even after hours, and you got to help people with decisions or make decisions or respond in a way and that you didn't have to before, and it became harder. And then if you haven't built the relationships outside of work, then I think it's a struggle. And I think that's oftentimes why we feel better sometimes of going to work than we do at staying at home or going to work, but instead of doing something outside of work, because we've learned to build that relationship with our coworkers, or maybe it's a partner you have, or someone that you become friends with, and you see them 8, 9, 10 hours a day, and then you go home, and you got to re-engage. And I saw this most play out along the lines of trust. And so I talk about 3 things in my work with leaders and with other individuals, and that's trauma, trust, and hope. And the part about the peace, when I think there's a lack of peace, is because there's trauma that has affected your relationships with people, that contributes to more trauma, because there's more dysregulation, because we struggle to trust each other. One of the things, again, I learned, later in life is that it's intuitive. I guess I knew it, but until someone sort of pointed it out, we're designed to be social creatures. We're designed to have, relationships with people. And we can only do that if we've built trust. But if we experience the trauma in our lives early on with the people that we should have trusted, maybe it's our parents or other adults, and they somehow violated that trust, then what makes you think that when I show up at work or when I'm trying to build a relationship with you, that I'm just going to automatically, instinctively be trustful? You've got to earn that trust, because everybody else in my life has been untrustworthy. And so it's just this vicious cycle of how do you do that? And we do it all the time. I tell people we do three things with trust. We're either building trust, spending trust, or breaking trust.
It's like a bank, isn't it?
It is. And so
the bank of trust.
we don't appreciate that until we wake up one day going, I wonder how come I don't trust that person, or why don't they trust me? And we realize that we've been doing a lot of withdrawals instead of a lot of deposits into that metaphor of the bank. But and so the people I engaged at work, that because they were committing some type of crime that brought them to our attention, right? It's easy to fall into that trap of, well, I can't trust anybody, or nobody's trustworthy. Every time I look around, somebody's defrauding other people or committing some act of violence against them. And that's just the way people are. Right? That's just the way people are. And then we start hearing other people echo that chamber around us. And so we start believing everybody must be that way except me and you, and I'm not so sure about you. Right? And so what do we do to break that cycle? What do we do to help our minds sort of heal in a way that we can start to trust each other? And what's that look like? So that's where I think at the end state is that idea of peace. But there's things we got to do to get there.
Do you know, I think that's so important, because a lot of people don't talk about the fundamental of trust in order to rebuild people and to rebuild the networks, the neural networks that you have in your mind. Because if your neural networks have been conditioned in an environment where there is no trust,
that's right.
The more lack of trust you experience, and we don't necessarily talk about how our brain evolves as a consequence of our surroundings, but the reality is, if you're in a surrounding that there's no trust, in order for you to survive, you're going to work on the premise that you can't trust anybody. Because that aids your survival. That's how we evolve as humans. And the greater the safety we can create for people, and that starts with children at a very young age, is creating that emotional safety net for kids to express themselves so that they can trust you to be there for them in the way that they need you. And it's the same as we mature as adults, is trusting people to really be there for us and support us. And I think it's really such a key point that we don't talk about enough in the context of trauma, is this breaking of trust.
People don't want to talk about trauma, right? I mean, we don't want to talk about the weighty, heavy measures. I mean, when I go and try to engage leaders in the organization, look, they want to talk about burnout. They want to talk about turnover. They want to talk about performance issues. They're okay talking about trust, but I'm not so sure I want to talk about trauma. Trauma seems kind of weighty and heavy and
too difficult.
Too difficult, right?
Too scary. It's like,
very much. And so it's like, that's kind of a personal issue, right? I mean, that's you. Can we even talk about it? And so I try to find ways to engage individuals in a way that might be a little bit more open-minded. And we gravitate toward trust because we see that play out in our lives every day. We understand trust. And as you said, the breaking of trust and the building of trust. And so trauma allows me to explain not every, I don't ever say that trauma is the answer to every last problem, but it allows me
Yeah.
to open the door and explain why we struggle with trust. And
Yeah.
if you want to understand trust, let's understand trauma enough that we can have that conversation and better appreciate. And then obviously, as I said at the end, it's like, okay, what do we do with that understanding now? How do we actually go about building trust? And for me, it's that strategy and the framework of hope that gets us there. But yeah, trust is fundamental. If the negative side of that's the trauma, then to me, the positive side of trust is hope. But you got to get people willing to engage in the conversation. And we know when it comes to mental health and other issues, that is probably one of the biggest challenges, just getting people to feel comfortable talking about it.
Yeah, and I think it's I wholly agree, and I think that trust piece is so important in the workplace. You know, we've come into a space of the digital age where we expect people to work remotely now because the reality is that's what they have to do. And some people have come from a work environment where that trust is significantly lacking because the culture hasn't fostered the fundament, and trust is a core value for me, that the culture hasn't fostered that value to empower people to do the work that is necessary and get the job done. And it disempowers people when that trust isn't present. People become defensive because that's how we survive.
I don't know what it's like in the UK, but there's been a number of media reports about people not wanting to go back to the office, right? They enjoy being at home and working from home. Now, I'm sure there's a part of that just says this is more comfortable working from home. But I'd like to do some research, and maybe there's some out there that I haven't seen yet. But I'm pretty sure that a significant portion of the people who don't want to go back to the office, it's not so much COVID. It's the fact that at the office,
it's the culture.
There's a lot of unpeaceful people, a lot of chaos, a lot of noise, a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety.
Yeah.
Why do I need to put up with that? Because at least COVID has shown us that when we do work from home, we can still get our jobs done. And if we can do our jobs without having all this stress around us, this trauma, this craziness, then why would I go back to that? And so I don't think it's just, I mean, yes, part of it would be a COVID related issue, but at the end of the day, I think we're so unhappy and are not at a place of peace, a state of peace, that we're longing for it. And we're longing for those relationships because it's hard to trust anybody. It's hard to interact with them. And so I think it all sort of comes together. And when you start seeing the pieces and understand things and see a little bit differently, we see how this plays out in our regular lives, our daily lives.
And what really triggered you to know the really important aspect of trust and its relationship to trauma in terms of your experiences? Did it evolve this need to really explore the concept of trust and to build it, or was it a particular key event where you thought, whoa, this is it?
I think it's part of an evolution. And so my evolution starts a little bit like this. So I've been in the FBI at this point 20 years, and I promote to the special agent in charge for the office in Mississippi. So I arrive in Mississippi, and in my position, I'm responsible for everything that goes on in the state. And the capital of Mississippi is Jackson, Mississippi. And Jackson at the time still does, but has a lot of problems. And in my role at the FBI, I think, well, how can I help? How can I help the FBI solve the problems? And I got to reading some articles and talking to people and realizing that juvenile crimes was very high. There was a lot of gun violence, a lot of other violence among juveniles, relating in an increase in their engagement with the juvenile justice system. And so I remember going with a good friend of mine to a high school, and he said, "Chris, we're going to talk to about 10 young men who have been making some bad decisions, right? They're sort of in trouble in school. They've got some challenges, and I'm going to talk to them, try to figure out if we can help them in some way." I said, "It'd be great. I'd love to go." And so we showed up, and I remember arriving at this school. It's an inner city school. And just going through the neighborhood, you're looking around, realizing this is a very socioeconomically depressed area. And you arrive at the school, and there's fences around it, and I'm looking up, and I'm seeing, some broken windows. I walk up to the front doors, and they're all dented and in a little bit disrepair. You walk into the school, and there's a school resource officer, in a uniform and a gun. You walk through a magnetometer to see if you're carrying some type of weapon, and that's even before you really get into the school. And so we walk in, and some of the tiles and the floors were chipped, the paint's peeling on the wall a little bit, and we make it to the library where we're going to engage these young men. And I remember Ruth sitting there and just looking at these young men who were probably sizing me up, trying to figure out who this guy was in the suit. I certainly didn't fit in with any of the demographics in that area. And I remember my friend told me that we're going there to try to help these 10 young men. But in the end, I realized it was actually what they said, that they probably had a bigger impact on me than I ever had on them. And the first young man, one of the young men said, we've only been in school a couple of months, and I've been suspended from school longer than I've been in school. So he'd been out in the first 2 months, he'd been out of school longer than he'd actually been in school. And then the second young man said, I'm tired of disappointing my mama. And I knew exactly what he meant, right? Making bad decisions, doing things. But I think it was that third young man who really impacted me the most, and sort of a quiet voice with his head down a little bit. He said, I haven't seen my father in a while. He's been in jail. Now, I can tell you, I'd heard those stories time and time again. We've all heard those stories. We've read them. We've seen them on the news. But there was something about being in that room with them at that moment in time and having them share, being a little vulnerable and share with me some of the adverse childhood experiences, the traumas they'd gone through, that really had an impact. And so I literally left there saying, I've got to learn more about what goes into the makeup and the lives of these young men. And as I did that, that's where I learned more about the ACE science and about trauma. And it sort of all of a sudden, it was like somebody, shone a big bright light on the problem. And it was like that puzzle piece that was missing from the puzzle that you're trying to put together. It's like, this is the reason why we continue to see the same people over and over again from the same families, the same communities, with the same issues, and nothing ever changes. It's always the poverty. It's always the violence. It's always the lack of resources. And we just know where those communities are. And it's like, why? Why is that? And for me, it was this a better understanding of how trauma and it affected their lives, shaped their lives. And then I realized that it just isn't those who are in poverty. It just aren't those who are in the poorer parts of town or have the bigger problems. The adverse childhood experiences and that childhood trauma affects people regardless of their background, regardless of demographics. It could be poor or rich or urban or rural, or it could well-educated or it didn't matter. We've all experienced that to some extent. And then I won't go into the research, you know it better than I, but it just was pervasive. And I didn't understand it. And I knew my colleagues and friends did. And so it was then I started trying to share what I was finding with the people in the criminal justice system and who I worked with. And I realized that I'm having problems engaging people and building that trust. And I'm seeing other people really not trusting others. And I started putting the two and two together and realizing that for a lot of those poor relationships, it was the unaddressed trauma that was affecting it. And I started thinking about the leadership. Again, I like to think in the leadership of an organization like the FBI, it's pretty good. We the best, the brightest come to the top. And I look back and I go, yeah, not so much. Why is that? Why do we have so many leadership books? Why do we have so much leadership training going on? And we still do the same problems over and over again. And the one thing I wasn't hearing was how trauma affected our ability as leaders and as followers, employees, in that relationship where you've got to have trust between the leadership and the employees. And so for me, that was where, again, it took a couple of years, it started coming together. But even then, I walked away going, okay, what do I really want to tell you? Okay, trust is a problem because of trauma, but how do we fix it? Or we just be nicer to people, we just have a little bit more empathy and patience. And then, yes, those are important, but that's where I came across Dr. Hellman's work on the science of hope and the framework around hope. And I realized, that's the piece that was missing for me as I try to explain to people how to really make a difference and put all this together in a meaningful way.
I think that's really beautiful. And I also think that lack of trust can also create trauma. So if you, as a leader, have had an adverse childhood experience or whatever it happens to be, and you can't build trust because you don't have it in yourself, you can traumatize other people through your interaction.
Absolutely.
Because you are not exhibiting a safe environment because you've grown up in an environment or experienced an environment that is unsafe, where that trust was missing. And I don't think we pay enough credence to that relationship between the two. Okay. You have to have trust in order to build good relationships, irrespective. And I think, Dr. Gabor Mate, who's done a beautiful video, Wisdom of Trauma, a beautiful film, where he gets the inmates in the US. They ask questions. They're all standing in a circle, and they ask questions around adverse childhood experiences. Have you ever experienced? And the majority of the inmates that are there have experienced trauma to one degree or many degrees. They keep stepping in, and you see that many people step into that inner circle because they've had many layers of trauma. And if we think of trauma as like a seed, the earlier the seed is planted, the more opportunity it has to grow. And if you keep exposing a child or a young adult to the same or similar traumatic event or experience, that seed will take root, and the tree will get stronger and stronger and stronger, and the more branches it will have. So the harder it is to remove the trauma, because if you've got the wrong therapy, you will cut down one branch, but you won't remove the root. So the seed is still, the seed is still there, the tree is still there, and it's still growing. And it's really important that we take the time to find out where the root is, so that we can remove it, and let release people from the emotional, the physical, the mental, or the spiritual pain that trauma has caused them, and allow them to recalibrate their brain back to a new normal, much like COVID. It's getting us back to a new, calmer, peaceful normal that we can live with. We can live with ourselves, and I think COVID is a really, poignant example, is that need to have trust in people, that need to have trust that people will protect each other, and it's not all for yourself, and I'm not going to do this because I don't want it, I don't believe in it. It's about the survival of your group, your family, your tribe, and ultimately the human race.
That's right.
From a big picture perspective, and in order to do that, we have to build trust that people will do what's right, to support the team, whatever that team concept may be. How do the people that you coach and consult deal with this concept of trauma? Because I know people see it as oh, this isn't my problem, but actually it's everybody's problem, because we all have a role to play in helping people let go of trauma, and also minimizing the trauma that we could potentially inflict on others through our behaviors.
When I talk to leaders, I usually will talk about some of Dr. Brene Brown's work. She's very popular, right? She talks about vulnerability, and we talk about this idea that leaders need to be more vulnerable. And of course, that scares us, right? We're talking, vulnerable. I don't want to be more vulnerable. I'm supposed to be the strong leader. And so she does a great job of explaining that vulnerability is not a weakness.
It's a strength.
It is a strength. And so
really good one.
It is. And when you talk about it, it's interesting. In her book that she wrote, Daring Greatly, she talks about hope in there for a page or two. And so what I do, and it's almost like a light bulb moment sort of going off. And I use vulnerability in something that people generally are open to, because she does a great job of helping us understand. I say, when you're more vulnerable, you're able to build that relationship of trust with people, because you're more authentic, and you're sharing, and you're doing things. I said, and all the literature says that, and you would agree, right, that we want to, as leaders, create a safe, stable, and nurturing environment in our work environment. We need to do that. And I said, and we want to build relationships, because that's important for people to have relationships. That's great too. I said, okay, well, let's talk about what keeps us from individually being vulnerable, and keeps us from building some of those relationships. And it doesn't take long to sort of find an event in their past, again, usually their childhood, where they were conditioned early on that this is how a child behaves, this is how a child reacts, this is what you say and don't say, this is how you're supposed to respond. And all of a sudden, when they get to the workplace, when they become leaders, and they engage with people, something triggers that immediate response that all of a sudden they've got to be, hard and fast. And it's like, well, what happened to being vulnerable and sharing and being open? And, now you're, okay. So it was something in my past that triggered my response today. Absolutely. So I can talk about trauma in a way that isn't always heavy, isn't always traumatic, because I start first with talking to you about things that leadership in general, leaders, that we discuss, things that we're a little bit more comfortable with, like the vulnerability, like engagement and building relationships, like the need for trust. But I always have to go back and say, well, what triggers us in our inability to build that trust? It's that trauma. It's what we experienced early in life. Okay, well, how do I change that? Now you're asking the right questions. How do I change that? And so that's how I approach it. And then generally, like I said, with the individuals I've worked with, it is sort of that light bulb moment. Now, it may take a little bit of time to sort of really wrestle with it, but if they're open to it, they'll come to realize that, yes, I need to see the world differently. I need to sort of shift my paradigm. And yes, let's talk more about what we can do to build those safe environments and to build the relationships that we need to be successful, no matter how you define success. If it's better team performance, if it's better selling, because you're salespeople, almost however you define success, at the heart of it, there's some type of trust issue if you're not really seeing it the way you want to see it. And so I'm able to talk to people in that way.
Do you know, I think that's really important. And I think, we have to trust the environment to be vulnerable. It's fundamental that we have to trust that it is a safe place. And as soon as people say, oh, it's safe, and it turns out it isn't, which happened to me in the corporate world. Oh, yes, tell us what give us your inner thoughts and how we can change the organization. It's a safe environment. Nothing goes outside these four walls. And the very next day I get a telephone call from a partner who wasn't even there, berating me for expressing myself.
Right.
You know, you have to, and that completely, you know, at that point there was no trust. I could trust no one in the organization because it was eroded by a director in the firm. And I think it's important that we create that. It's so important to create that environment to build trust, isn't it? So we can express our vulnerabilities and know it's not going to go back against us. And often the leaders have put their defenses up and they think this is how I need to behave. This is the persona I have to give out. Whereas inside, you know, it's like an armadillo. They're really hard on the outside and just really vulnerable and soft and squidgy on in the middle. And they're afraid to express themselves because of the consequences.
And again, if I ask you or any of your listeners or viewers to say, have you ever had a great leader? They invariably will say yes, because they had a lot of bad leaders. And when you discuss with them, what is it that made that person somebody you really appreciated, respected, that you wanted to follow? Trust is one of the words that always comes out. I trusted them. And so, you know, you look at the organizations and you look at these toxic relationships, and why are we building why are we building an organization that fosters a lack of trust? Why would we engage in activities that are going to encourage people to break trust? Because that's how you get ahead. That's how you make a sale. That's how you do better.
That's how you get yourself, above somebody else.
And instead, if we really, and Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great, talks about that level 5 leader who's able to step off to the side and really appreciate and admire and encourage his followers, his employees. Well, I assure you that the only way a leader is going to be able to do that is if he not only trusts himself, but has built trust in his relationship, and frankly is at peace with who he or she is and who their employees are. It's only then that you can really move from good to great and sustain greatness in many ways. And so, I think that I spent a lot of time, unfortunately, in many ways, late in my career before I realized the connection. And so then I retired, but it's been since I retired that I've been, you know, sort of preaching this gospel, as we say, that, you know, trauma, trust, and the science of hope is really what I think is foundational in being not only a person that you can respect and be respected, but that you can work for a respectful organization.
I know we're sort of kind of running a little bit out of time, and we haven't even got on to the science of hope, which I'm really fascinated about. So I'd love to have you come back if you would like to later, and we can talk about that again.
I'd love to do that. Yes.
But just quickly, could you just summarize what the science of hope is to the listeners? What is so fundamentally important about hope? I just think it is just massively important.
I think the important piece there is that it's an empowering framework. So Dr. Hellman, the way he summarized defines hope is the belief that tomorrow can be better than today, and that you have the power to make it so. So if we stopped at the fact that tomorrow can be better than today, that's just wishful thinking. Well, I just hope tomorrow's better. I hope I can't be any worse than today. I hope it gets better. And we see that. We just wish things were better. But with his framework that goes back for decades, even before him, around the idea of goals, pathways, and willpower, when we see that and work through that framework on a regular basis, then we can build that hope. And so if we want to build trust, there's a framework and a strategy for doing that that's centered around the science of hope that allows us to build the things that we're looking for, to accomplish the goals that we're setting, to be the people that we want to be, and eventually be at peace.
Yeah. Do you know, Allan, it's really powerful. And we had a previous guest, Amy Kardashian, who was on the show, who experienced major trauma. And she said hope is having open possibilities every day, and not closing those doors down, not, keeping an open mind.
Yeah, and it's definitely a way of thinking. It's a cognitive way of thinking, and we'll spend some other time talking about the amygdala and other things that you mentioned earlier. This hope is a protective factor against that stress, that burnout, that anxiety that we've been looking for a long time. It's a greater predictor than just even resilience or mindfulness or other things, and that's why I talk about it and include it as part of the work I do because it provides that complete picture.
Yeah, I think that's just absolutely, I'm really excited to further conversations. But the key theme on this was talking about trust and how trust, is so vitally important following people who've had traumas to build or rebuild the trust that may have been lost and to help people create the environment so that trust can be nurtured and the bank can be filled up with money, trust money again.
Yeah.
What would be your one piece of advice for somebody who really feels from a relationship perspective that they have no trust in people following their life experiences? What would be your one piece of advice to them?
Yeah, I think I've got to go back to the hope definition, right? Because when we've got to the point where we don't know how to trust, when we're scared of trust, when we are worried about our relationships, when everything has gone wrong, then we sort of fall into that idea or the trap that it's always going to be wrong. And we start seeing, despair and hopelessness come about. But it's with hope that we can, in a cognitive way of thinking, that we can understand that tomorrow will be better, not can be better. Again, optimism, but will be better, and that we have the power to do it. And so if people want to build that trust and they're open to the idea of learning, then we can learn trust because we can learn hope. And if we can learn hope, that means we can teach hope. And so it's not just I'll learn it, but I can teach it. And if I can teach it, then we can spread it. And if we can spread hope throughout not only our environment, our communities, our businesses, then we can start to spread hope throughout our countries in a way that's not just wishful thinking, but that can truly make a difference in the lives of people.
Wow, Christopher, I think that's really powerful. And my goodness, don't we need more people like yourselves to be able to instill that hope in others and to share that message of hope as well. How can people get hold of you if they want to learn more about yourself?
So I think the best way is sort of visit my website. It's mrchrisfreeze.com. I do a lot of work on LinkedIn. I do a little bit of Facebook and a little bit of Twitter, Instagram, but really most of my work is on LinkedIn, which I found to be a better platform for this. So I encourage you, you can send me a message through my website, or you can send me a message through LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to respond and help in any way I can.
Yeah, thank you. And do make sure that you reach out to Christopher. He's a fountain of knowledge, and obviously that knowledge is growing as he's going back to rebuild his learned career as his PhD. So I'm sure the more people that connect with you and you can learn from, the just amazing superpower in yourself to really make a difference and help instill change and hope in others. So thank you for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. Just thank you for your wisdom and for inspiring hope in others.
Well, thank you, Ruth. And I appreciate the fact that you're willing to undertake this great endeavor to share how to have a stronger and healthier brain and why that's so important. It's been a pleasure for me to be a guest today, and I'm grateful for that and for your service. So thank you.
Oh, you're most welcome. And just remember that this is the show Brain Health, Unchaining Your Pain. You are not stuck with the brain you have. You can make it better. And we are here to support you in unchaining, unlocking and unleashing your full potential.
I really hope you enjoyed that conversation. Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to like and share this episode and leave a review on my website or on Apple Podcasts. If you're looking for opportunities to optimize your brain health or unchain your pain from a past trauma, make sure you visit my website www.ruthmaryallen.com and use the code podcast10 at checkout to get 10% off all programs. And always remember, you are not stuck with the brain you have. You have the power to make it better. You have the power to unchain your pain and optimize your brain power and performance so that you can win back energy and time doing what you love.
Each episode of Brain Health Unchaining Your Pain with Dr. Ruth Allan is for educational and demonstration purposes only. The information shared in each episode should not be interpreted as medical advice. This episode should not be used to self-diagnose or self-treat any health, medical or physical condition. Do not use this episode to avoid going to your healthcare professional or to replace the advice they give you. Consult with a trusted healthcare professional before doing anything contained in this episode. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact www.ruthmaryallen.com/connect.